Hello and welcome to the Roar of Love podcast. And this is where spiritual wisdom meets the wild human experience and heart-centered transformation takes the central stage. We're hosted on Sacred Lights. Each week, we're exploring deep truths, the spiritual path, and the power of love to awaken and heal. So let's go ahead and jump in and get started. So today we are diving into one of the most beautiful and challenging parts of the human experience. So this is our relationships. But not from the usual perspective of like tips or tools. Instead, we're going to explore the spiritual dimensions of connection, what relationship really teaches us, and how they can serve for, or how it can serve for a mirror of our evolution. For me, this has been a lifelong path. At first, I saw relationships as interactions. Then I began to understand them as evolutionary tools. And eventually, I came to see that all life is relationship, and that my relationships with others, with nature, with the divine, with myself, each one echoes the other. And this very much formulated the foundation of the way that I was working. And in truth, it was the fracturing of my relationships. It was the wounding around relationship that led to my curiosity and ultimately to my spiritual study of relationships. And so I started to ask this question: how is every relationship a mirror for who I am, for my soul, for from the deep essence of me, for the personality, for the way that I show up to the world? How can I see each type of relationship as this mirror? So today I'm going to invite you into an exploration of the sacred reflection of the relationship. So in my view, every relationship carries a hidden curriculum. And that may not be new to you. It teaches us how we connect, where we resist, how we expand, how we protect. Relationships show us what we value, what we fear, what we need, and what we avoid. And it was over time that I found that through my practices of ritualized devotion, that I started to see that they were a powerful tool for exploring relational dynamics. And so I started to look at where I was placing a flower on an altar, how I was singing to the divine, where I was in communion, and I began to notice how my energy met the world. And this, how my energy met the world, was informing me about deep layers of energetic interaction with what was around me. And so it helped me see, okay, am I really communicating with love here? Is there too much control? Is there longing? Is there resistance? Where was I able to connect and where was I not able to connect? And it was through this exploration, through ritualized devotion, that I was actually not only able to deepen my connection with spirit and to understand how I could keep going and deepening my connection with spirit, but it was also an opportunity for me to understand where the holes, where the challenges, where the redirects or the limitations were in the way that I also related to people. And for me, because of my past, it was actually one was easier for me than the other. It was actually through my love and devotion and connection with spirit and my exploration of what that relationship was, where its strengths and limitations were, that then I was able to start to transfer some of that information into everyday relationship and vice versa. But I did find that that tool was particularly helpful. So all of it became a reflection, a chance to study myself through this sacred mirror of relationship. And I started to deepen my understanding more and more of what is possible through relationship, through this devotional study, and through the devotional study of relationship in general, how we relate to the people in our lives. We're all going to start at a different place, and it doesn't matter where we start. So sometimes that can be something that people use against them. I know I used that against myself for a really long time. So you could say, well, we're supposed to start, I'm supposed to be more like this. If I was more spiritual, then I would be able to be more in relationship, or I would show up this way, or I would say these things. We're going to get into a little bit about some of the things that we say to ourselves in relationship to relationship. However, one of the things to remember is that it doesn't matter where we start, just like it doesn't matter where we start in our communion with God. What it matters is that we start, and that we're all going to develop along that continuum. And if we use each opportunity that we get to just take one step further, regardless of where we start, we wind up in a place of deeper communion. And it can sometimes be frustrating to see the places where we have difficulties, where we have breaches, where we have oversights, and where it's challenging for us to come into relationship with the divine, or where it's challenging to come into relationship with the people in our lives, or anything. Sometimes it can be our relationship to food, or to pleasure, or to any exercise, anything that is in our life. So we sometimes it's challenging to see those components. However, once we start to approach this process and realize that we can learn and grow, and we can use some of the practices of devotion, and we can use some of our understanding in one area, for example, like I was talking about in spiritual study, in the act of spiritual devotion, to help infuse another area, like for example, our relationships with food or our relationships with people, then we can start to grow and develop from where we are to our next step. And that's all we're doing, really, is stepping along the path into creating more and more of what it is that we want. So one of the things that gets in our way some of the times, or one of the ways that we can think about this, you might have heard of attachment theory. And so attachment theory helps us understand how we relate to things. And so it's a useful lens. You can see attachment as anxious, avoidant, or disorganized. And those are three categories that are commonly used inside of attachment theory. And so we get to explore these foundational ways, foundational dynamics, and then how they might show up in terms of our spiritual practice in our relationship with others. So you can definitely look at attachment theory and look at how you relate to others and explore and find some very useful tools inside of that. And today we're going to look at it a little bit more inside of how it might show up in terms of our spiritual relationship. Our spiritual relationships, or our relationship to spirit, is a better way of saying that. So basically, an avoidant pattern is just that. It avoids. It moves away from. It splits off from. And so an avoidant pattern can look like spiritual independence. It's really masking a fear of intimacy. So the avoidant, it like runs away from intimacy, and they do that in various different ways. We'll go into that a little bit more. So anxious attachment is really that desire to like kind of grab onto. It's concerned that it's going to be abandoned. There's a fear of abandonment. And disorganized attachment kind of bounces back and forth between these two, where sometimes it's avoidant, sometimes it's anxious. It's not really predictable in the way that it plays out. And of course, there's secure attachment, right, which creates the most amount of potential for connection. So in an example of an avoidant pattern as like spiritual independence, right? A person might insist on doing all of their spiritual practice alone. They're avoiding community. They don't need a teacher. They get all their guidance from within. And while all of these things might be true at one time or another, this can also be a way to avoid vulnerability. A way of, like, for example, a teacher confronts us in a way, just like a relationship, like a romantic partnership or a friendship or a family member confronts us. And they reflect back to us things that are going on inside. When we stay in our own little bubble, it's possible to just keep on replicating the way that we see things. Right? So the avoidant personality might avoid that type of vulnerability and deeper connection. And so it's a fear of being seen, it's a fear of needing others. And so very often, if we were to look at our spiritual development, we might say that desire to like move away, like not need a community, not need a teacher, I can do it on my own, that kind of thing might be a way of being able to actually cover up these deeper vulnerabilities, and which could stop a deeper communion from happening, a deeper knowledge, a deeper knowing from unfolding. Of course, that is also something that's going to show up in our personal relationships and can show up into our relationships to everything inside of life, right? So our anxious attachment, so a anxious attachment could show up, for example, as like a search for divine union. Okay, so this might be the devotional practice, but the person who constantly seeks signs and messages and approval from the divine, they want to feel one with God. But underneath it all is this fear of being left unseen or unloved. So that is like, you could also be seen in human relationships, right? The person wants to be very close. They want to confirm that they're close all the time, confirm those messages, confirm those words of love, confirm that they have that approval, love, or attention, because really that's covering over the fear of abandonment. And so this shows that there's an insecurity. There's like this is a different type of like lack of faith in the divine. So we could say that about both of them, right? So there's lack of faith, lack of trust that is at the root of both the anxious and the avoidant approaches, because they don't trust that connection is there. And so secure attachment, on the other hand, is going to support a true spiritual connection, right? This is where someone can be part of a spiritual community while still having healthy boundaries. They can have solitude and connection. They can grow on their own, and they can also grow with others. They're going to feel a sense of safety, a sense of inner trust. They're going to feel more integrated overall in terms of their spiritual growth. And so that secure attachment is really something that we can look to build through spiritual practice. And so that's one of the things that I love here, is because actually we can grow and deepen our own spiritual connection and attunement, and also grow and deepen our ability to be in connection with all things inside of our life and people. And again, it doesn't matter where you start. It's just that you use whatever is in front of you to grow and learn, and then you can take the next step. So with this, you can use ritual or devotional practice to actually be able to deepen into and to be able to understand more of how to build healthy connection. So we're actually able to, with each time we should put that altar together, we put that flower on the altar, we seek that song. Each time we do something, we recognize where our strengths and limitations are. We get to then take an action that starts to move the energy in a direction that supports deeper communion. And again, one area might be easier than another, but if we can practice it in an area that's easier, for example, if that putting that flower is the easier thing to do, and we can learn where we have the strengths and weaknesses in that, and then we can apply that over into another area of our life, we can start to grow in many different areas of our life. So in this way, ritual and devotion becomes this lens, becomes this tool, rather, becomes a tool for us to expand our connection and our understanding of what our connection is, our understanding of relationship, and also be able to move and expand that in every area of our life. So this makes our spiritual practice potentially be very powerful for the deepening of our relationships, and it makes our relationships potentially very powerful tools for deepening our spiritual communion. And there's a lot of different ways that this has been talked about over time. But it becomes, when we start to reflect this way and use this type of information and use the tools that we have available to us, we can deepen very much in terms of our connection, our communion. So one of the things that happens inside of all of this is spiritual bypassing. So spiritual bypassing is where someone uses spiritual concepts to avoid uncomfortable emotions or truth. So an example of this might be like everything happens for a reason, right? And then that's used to either avoid accountability or used to stop looking at what's really happening in a situation. There's also, or an expression like, they're just not vibrating at my level. They're not at my level. It's used as dismissal, a way of being able to feel superior, not really going into what's happening in that relationship. So one of the challenges is that sometimes spirituality, one of the things that can happen, I just talked about how we can use spiritual practice to deepen into the understanding of relationship, deepen into communion, and we can use relationship to deepen into spiritual understanding, right? That piece, but the opposite is also true, right? So sometimes spirituality becomes a shield from intimacy. And it actually, it helps us to have rationalizations, justifications, the religious justifications for spiritual justifications, consciousness justifications for what it is, for what we are not willing to come into contact with, to really know. And this is a very deep study, because it's like the bottom line is, if our spiritual practice doesn't bring us into closer into honesty, into vulnerability, and into love, right, then it's probably not a spiritual practice. So if it's moving us into a place of like greater spiritual isolation, then perhaps it's going against the understanding of what we know to be some of the deeper spiritual messages that are out there. What are our unity, our connectiveness. So spirituality should potentially provide us with tools that like bring in the glue, bring in the connective pieces, help us to be able to interact and connect more. And so this is an issue that I know personally quite well. So because of, as I was saying, the way that I grew and developed, kind of coming from this perspective of like deep relational wounding, moving into spiritual practice, really deepening into the devotional spiritual practice, which was based on relationship, but it still maintained a component of bypassing, a component of moving out of connection or away from connection. And there were many things that I was taught along the way, many practices that I was taught, orientations that I was taught, teachers that I worked with, that will continue to affirm that this disconnect was actually a sign of deeper spiritual development. And so sometimes people think that in terms of relationship, they think, oh, well, now I've learned to be above the getting upset about things. I've learned to be above getting angry about a certain injustice, or I've learned to, different things. And actually what that is it's a sophisticated defense mechanism that actually is removing us from being in clear, honest, and true communion with the world around us. And so we want to be on the watch for that, how we can actually develop and use spirituality as a way of buffering us rather than deepening, as I was talking about before, buffering us from coming into a more honest relationship with the world around us. And there are a number of practices that do this, that will show that if you live in greater and greater isolation and more distance from the world and from the people around you, then that is actually a sign of your spiritual development. So the question might be inside of this is like, am I using spirituality to move through my pain or to avoid it? Am I using spirituality to connect more or to avoid it? And we start to watch this in ourselves. And in a different one in this category, right, is that sometimes forgiveness can be used to overcome emotional suppression. So by forgiveness, I would also include things like understanding. And I understand that. I know why that person is doing that. I understand it, or I've forgiven them for what it is that has happened. And that's great. If understanding and forgiveness are truly present, those are wonderful things to have be a part of the equation. But sometimes when somebody is trying to, I would say, like, I use the words like try to work above their actual level of operating. They might try to impose forgiveness on themselves or impose understanding on themselves in order and push down what they're actually feeling. And it moves us out of honesty with ourselves. And moving out of honesty with ourselves creates this dissonance. It creates a space of a disconnect. And so we want to, as I was saying before, it doesn't matter where you are. It more matters that you're able to be honest about where you are, be clear about where you are. We're all going to start in different places, and we all have things to learn. And that's one of the most beautiful things in relationship, is the understanding of the vulnerability of each one of us, our own vulnerability and the vulnerability of the people around us. And that everybody is working on something in relationship to relationships. And that the more that we can get that, the more that we start to deepen into that understanding of the vulnerability that we all share as human beings, the more that we can accept where we are and accept where others are. And we can start, instead of protecting ourselves through these shields, we can start to use spirituality to actually come into deeper communion, to honest conversation, to acknowledge the places that are difficult for us, to be able to witness and hold the places that are difficult for another person, to come into that real understanding, the working relationship. Because I said you could learn all these different things. Earlier, I said you can learn all of these different things through relationship, right? It's so many different ways that we can understand it. So it's actually the workshop of relationship that is the beautiful thing. It's that in this, it's not the right or wrong of it, the yes or no of it. It's the workshop. It's that we're all in a workshop, able to understand more and more of the different components of relationship through being in communion with each other, with the world around us. And we can grow in our capacity to work with all of these different elements, which is to grow in our spiritual capacity. And one could say that we would be practicing either a magical art or an alchemical art of being able to work with what is around us to be able to create more and more of what we want in terms of the way that we're in the world. But this all comes down to, it's rooted in that vulnerability. That vulnerability brings us to that place of truthfulness. And from there, we can do a lot of different things. It doesn't mean that you can do everything with all people, that every problem can be sorted. That's almost like almost another snag that we can hit. It's not that everything can be sorted all the time, so much as that we are now in a workable place and we can start to decide which projects we want to work on and which ones maybe are for another day, and which ones are not really developing in the way that we would like them to develop. So connection, relationship is really, you could say it's a spiritual technology. It helps us dissolve the illusion of separateness and helps us bring ourselves back into community, into unity, into the remembrance of the fact that we're all interconnected. So relationship is really like that connection. And through the process of engaging in that connection and working with it, workshopping it, as I was saying, we get to move more and more into that understanding of our interconnectedness, which helps a whole bunch of things come online in terms of our understanding, our spiritual understanding. So each form of relationship has its own teaching. So when we approach relationship this way, everything, every type of relationship to every aspect of our life, every type of person in our life, every way that we engage with that person, all of those become these portals, they become these pathways to the divine. They're not distractions from the path. Like even when they're problems, right? Sometimes people say, well, that person is a problem, and therefore they're a distraction from what it is that I'm trying to do, which is be more spiritual. But no, they're not, even if that means they're not spiritual at all, or they're a problem, or whatever it is however that person is showing up. We don't necessarily need to embrace like a specific way of being with it, but it is an invitation. So it's an invitation for us to become more aware, to become more connective, to understand how to work with relationships more. When we look at someone or some aspect of our life and we push it away and try not to be in relationship with it, you could say is what, it's like we try not to be in relationship with it in some way, then, or we make it an obstacle to being in relationship with spirit the way that we want to, we create these problems. We create these like kind of mountains out of molehills. So these, like, really, it's a small mound that needs to be worked with rather than a giant mountain. And so when we start to realize that every relationship and all aspects of them can be these opportunities, can be these portals, and we understand that this vulnerability of humanness is at the heart of our being able to be present, we sink in more deeply to the field of relationships, and we're able to learn in a deeper and deeper way. Again, Doesn't matter where we are in that continuum. We can start wherever we are and we can move a little bit further. Each step that we take will inform us and allow us to see more of what is sacred in the relationships around us. And so we learn through applying spiritual practice. We can apply spiritual practice to our everyday relationship lives. And we can we can apply things that we learn through relationship to how to deepen into spiritual understanding. Because sometimes people make spiritual practice too complicated or too distant or too something that they don't do or whatever it is. So we can go both ways to help to open up a deeper and deeper way of communing with what is around us. And this expands our hearts. It expands our hearts. It helps us see the interconnectedness of everything. It helps us to be able to work with it and to receive some of the benefit of what being able to be in relationship is all about. So there are so many different ways to explore relationship by seeing the divine where we were not able to, by seeing opportunity instead of seeing obstacle, by being willing to move more into vulnerability and more into truth, through accepting where we are in our own development and taking the next step, through being willing to do that with the people around us and see them also on this journey of deeper unfolding and connecting. And so we can practice and step into each of these areas. And in this way, relationship becomes a revelation and connection becomes a communion and love becomes a doorway in which the sacred can enter our lives. And like any art form, because I believe this is an art form, we just learn to work at it, to perfect it, to grow it for no other reason than desire to do so. And that if we do that over time, we see more and more results in our lives. So for a little bit here, I'd like to answer some questions about relationship. And so we'll get down and maybe translate some of this information, some of what we've been talking about into real life, or just talk about other aspects of relationship for the rest of our time together. So one of the questions that, there's some really good questions today. Great. I will do my best. I'll do my best at these questions. So how do I know when to end a spiritual or romantic relationship? So how do we know when to end a relationship? And let's broaden this out a little bit, first of all. Like, how do I know when to end a relationship? Because maybe we want to end, there are all sorts of, we could have a relationship to our work. We could have a relationship to a particular habit. We could have a relationship to a person. But how do we know when something is like truly done? And this is one of the questions, one of the areas that I wind up working with people a lot on. And I wish that it was as easy as saying, here are 5 factors. If you look at these 5 factors, you're going to be able to know that a relationship is truly done. But it winds up landing because a lot of the decisions wind up being decisions between priorities rather than is this right or is this wrong? Should I or shouldn't I? Those are actually the easiest ones. Like if we have a really clear sense that something we're doing is like bad for us, for example, it might be easier to be able to say, okay, I know that's not so good for me. I'm not going to do it anymore. That relationship, I've recognized it's abusive. I'm not going to do it anymore. Those are more clear cut often. So if it's doing harm to us, if a relationship is doing harm to us, then that's a clear line, right? But very often it falls into areas that are not quite that clear, where it's much harder to determine whether or not something should truly end, because very often we have conflicting priorities in relationship to what like that person or something like that. For example, we might have a priority around a value, you could say it that way, around keeping a relationship together. Once married, always stay married, right? That could be something. And then we might also have a priority or a value around our own health and well-being. And those two things are not going together. We actually have to decide, go through the process of figuring out how we're going to make our decision. So like in the end, questions like, is it going to feel better if you make this decision or you make that decision, right? Is it going to feel better if you, at the end of your days, are you going to feel better if you honor your need for commitment? And for what a commitment means, for example, once married, stay married, or you honor your commitment to yourself. And so those questions push us very deep. This is part of how relationship teaches us, right? They push us very deep into ourselves to really consider what it is that we believe in and what it is that we're going to stand by in the course of our life. So that's one place that we start to figure out what our priorities truly are, what it is, what our values are, what we steer our life by, our North Star, however you want to say that. And we start to see what the relationship means in relationship to that higher priority, to that North Star. So that's one component. Another component, which isn't dissimilar, but it's kind of a different way of connecting to it, a different way of feeling or experiencing it, which is like an internal sense of rightness. And that can be very difficult to get to through the many different thoughts that we might have in and around a relationship and all the different effects that changing a relationship might have on our life. So when we go to this inner place, sometimes when we're able to cultivate enough clarity inside of ourselves, we can actually see what feels like a clear sense of yes or no in relationship to a relationship. So sometimes people might say something like, I woke up one day and I knew that I was going to stay in this relationship, for the rest of my life. I knew that I was going to leave this relationship. And there was that sense of clarity and knowing. Those on big things like long-term relationships and the people closest to us, major components of our life, getting to that place of certainty can be very challenging. And really, they can be some of the crucibles of life. Really, we do best when we work with them until we have as much clarity as we can stand to create, because and to work vigorously in that direction, because that type of discernment helps us overall in our life. So sometimes we struggle with the decision, like, should I be in this relationship or should I not be in this relationship? Should I take this job or should I not take this job, or should I leave it or should I not? And it's actually through going through the process of figuring out what really guides our life, what our highest, like our North Star, what our highest point of alignment is. Sometimes by going through that process, we grow so much, even though that time can be very, very difficult for us to work through and to figure out those things. So on the easy end, this is not so easy. Sometimes there are a lot of skills for people to learn around this. We could say that it's when a relationship is doing harm. That's a good way to know. And then on the other side, we have this alignment to what's at the highest, like the highest alignment point, and reconciling ourselves with that highest alignment point to produce that inner sense of clarity. Usually it takes a lot of questioning, a lot of reflection, and a lot of questioning. That's why it comes up so much, because people often want like a relief from that level of questioning in their life. All right. So is it possible to outgrow someone without abandoning them? Well, this is a very interesting question, because who is defining the fact that there's abandonment happening? So if the other person is defining that whether or not abandoning is happening, it will be challenging, because you might be doing everything to maintain the relationship despite your growth, but that the other person is perceiving abandonment, in which case you don't really have the ability to control another person's experience. On the other hand, is it possible for you to outgrow someone without you feeling the need to abandon them? And yes, of course, it's possible to grow beyond someone and still maintain some kind of a relationship with them that would not qualify as abandonment. Because how we relate to someone, how we're connected to someone, it has many different layers. So some of the best relationship examples are the ones that bring the most I feel the most peace about. They're the easier ones, right? Are times where I've outgrown a relationship, right? And in that outgrowing the relationship, what is left is really just love. And so there's no need to abandon that person. I haven't cut with that person. I still love them. I'm still in communion with them. I'm in connection with them on this deep level of love. And I'm able to maintain that. And it's something that I aspire to in all of my relationships, regardless of how they go. My goal is to move to a place of love with each person that I've had relationship with. And so whatever there is, whether it's me outgrowing them or something else, there's this opportunity to use that evolutionary process, almost like like the metaphor of the rock tumbler, to kind of polish and get down to what's most important. The willingness or the ability, even if there isn't a desire to relate, even if there aren't things in common, to hold that person with love. And if that works with the definition of not abandoning, then that is a way that it can happen. When we have certain behaviors or ways of relating that we've personally defined as being abandoning or not be abandoning, then it's like we can work with ourselves to be able to maintain those ways of being that we consider maintaining a connection. For example, some people might say, if I would have abandoned my family if I never returned home, and other people would, or that I always show up for holidays or something like that. Otherwise, I would be abandoning them. And so we can work with our own growth in relationship to that. So sometimes we perceive that a rift needs to be there or a break needs to be there, where it actually doesn't. We're imagining that our growth means that we need to cut from a connection with another person, and it could. It's not like it never means that. It could mean that, but it doesn't necessarily need to mean that. So we can approach relationship through this curious lens that I put forward before, allowing us to see new ways of being in communion, ways that feel the most evolved, the most supportive, the most helpful, the most loving. And we can try those on. That's part of where I said you are wherever you are, and you can grow however you would like to grow. You just can keep stepping in this direction. That's part of that. So we can evolve in our understanding of what abandonment means, what connection means, what preservation means, what really right relationship is, all of that kind of stuff through the exploration of relationship. And I think I might have time for like one more question. Let me see which one. Okay, how can I tell the difference between intuition and fear in relationships? So basically, we're asking about the difference between intuition and fear. And the way that I am understanding this is that in being in those attachment things that we were talking about, attachment dynamics, we might have fear in relationship. And that fear might like show up like, I don't want to see the person, I don't want to talk to them, I'm not so sure, that kind of thing, especially in like the avoidant personality. They might be more resistant, right? And then the anxious one, that fear might be like, well, maybe they don't really like me the way that I want them to, or maybe there's something else that's going on or something like that. Right, that's the fear piece. That could be from somebody who's maybe worried about the connection and has more anxious attachment. However, when people are sensitive, intuitive, or empathic, they often are also sometimes reading real events. So in other words, they're not really interested in that person, or there is something else that's going on and they're reading that correctly with their intuition, but they're not quite able to determine or distinguish between when they're kind of on track and they're clear and when they are just kind of going into their patterns. And so this creates a lot of misunderstanding inside of them, a lot of confusion. And so a lot of times people have learned to negate their intuition because most people haven't had an opportunity to grow up in an environment where their true intuition, insight, whatever that is, empathic ability, psychic capacity, they haven't had the ability to grow up in an environment where that skill set or that ability is reflected, right? So when that happens, there's a lot of distortion that's in the mix. And that leads to a lot of confusion, where if the opposite happens, if you were around or are around a lot of people who have those capacities well developed in themselves, and they're clearly reflecting back to you what it is that you're perceiving, and when you're off track, and there's of course trust and honesty and all of those kind of things in the mix, but when they're able to do that, then you're able to grow in your capacity to develop that tool of intuition so that you can see actually, oh, that's what fear feels like. And that's what my clear intuition looks like. So basically, what we do is we develop our capacity to discern between this is what my intuition feels like and this is what fear feels like. So we're actually dialing in on the cues, sensory cues that allow us to know the difference between the two. So it's not an immediate answer, right? It's a learned skill that we get over time. So we start to develop, just like we would have if someone had assisted us with it, we start to develop our capacity to deepen that intuition, like, and go, I know this is what it feels like when I'm perceiving clearly, when I'm seeing something, when I've got a good read of a situation where it's free from all the other stuff. And this is a situation where my my fear, I can feel that there's distortion, that my fear is in the mix, and it's creating a level of confusion for me, right? So we practice that just in the same way. As you can see, I'm really into practices and development and of our perception. So this is one of the ways, this is one of the times that we can do it, to start to anchor these sensory cues so that when something's happening, we're able to tell, right? So I'll give you an example. In my life, I went through a period of time where all of a sudden I was receiving the like psychic hits, you could say, where all of a sudden there would be a very strong impression of another person that would land in my mind and my awareness. And with this impression, when I first started receiving these impressions, I wasn't really clear. I was like, am I thinking about this person? Or is something else going on? Because it was like, sometimes it'd be like, I don't have any reason to be thinking about this person. Like, why would I be thinking about this person? Right? It's not in the general rotation of my thoughts. And so I started to see that there was a way that was like almost like I would almost describe it as a block. There was like a clarity. It arrived almost like a package in my consciousness. A package in my consciousness related to this person. And so I started to see that the way that information arrived was actually from external, like a package was delivered. So once I tuned in and like perceived more than, oh, I just thought about this person, I started to perceive how I thought about this person, how that information came in. I saw that it actually had qualities to it. Those I would consider like the sensations, right? Like it had qualities to it, things I was able to perceive that were different from other types of perceptions or thoughts that I had. And that allowed me to understand the nature of what was arriving. And so then I was able to go, oh yeah, those aren't my thoughts. Those are actually delivered from outside. And then I was able to work with them accordingly. So that's an example of how we take that kind of intuitive information. We start to work with it through understanding its how we sense it, how we perceive it, so that then we can start to differentiate between it and other things. We can do the same thing with our fear. We can understand how our fear moves, what it feels like, what we feel like when it's active, and then we can start differentiating between the two. All right, great. So really great questions. Thank you. I encourage you to write in with any questions you feel you can, stories or reflections. I'm happy to hear them, integrate them into a podcast in the future, or who knows what could emerge from that. I'm a creative person, but feel free to reach out. You can find me at sacredlights.com. You can find me at helenakate.com. And thank you for listening to Roar of Love, the podcast. If today's episode spoke to you, visit us at sacredlights.com for more insight, community, and guidance on your journey. And until next time, stay open, stay true, and keep answering love's call.